He called me brother while sleeping with my wife. But the cruelest part of the betrayal wasn't in the bed. The cruelest part was how he used her to ruin my career 40 years ago. And I just found his weak spot. I am Howard, and I spent 30 years of my life as a detective with the NYPD. I retired 5 years ago, trading the sirens of the city for the quiet, predictable rhythm of a seaside home. Predictable until last Tuesday. It wasn't a gunshot or a high-speed chase that shattered my peace. It was a leaking pipe in the attic. A small, insignificant thing that forced me up those dusty, creaking stairs, looking for the source of the drip. I swore under my breath, annoyed at the interruption to my morning coffee, never imagining that the leak was a metaphorical break in the dam, holding back 40 years of lies. By the way, if you're a fan of deep dive mystery and true stories of long-term revenge, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this whole thing unravels. The attic was where we stored the ghosts of our past. Old photo albums, forgotten furniture, and boxes labeled Christmas lights. But tucked away behind an old wedding dress garment bag was something I had never seen. A small wooden chest, clearly belonging to my wife, Diana. It was marked only with her maiden name, in handwriting I hadn't seen since we were young. It was locked with a tiny antique clasp. Curiosity, the trait that had defined my entire professional life, immediately took over. I found an old screwdriver and broke the lock in seconds. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and perfume. My hands, steady through countless arrests and confrontations, were trembling. The first thing I pulled out was a stack of letters tied with a frayed silk ribbon. The postmarks dated back to 1985, the first year Diana and I were married. I knew immediately, even before I read the signature. The handwriting was recognizable, clean, powerful, and sickeningly familiar. It was George's hand. George, my best friend, my golf partner, the man who was currently trying to sell me on a joint community investment. He called me brother. The words on the aged paper were not just flirtatious, they were intimate, detailing clandestine meetings and shared secrets from a time I thought was the purest and most innocent of our marriage. My breath hitched in my throat. 40 years. 40 years of shared holidays, raising a son, and quiet evenings, all built on this foundation of deceit. My vision tunneled. The betrayal was a physical punch. Beneath the letters, wrapped in faded velvet, was a piece of jewelry. A heavy silver locket with an intricate forget-me-not design. It was beautiful, expensive-looking, and completely unfamiliar. Diana had never worn it. I opened it, expecting a picture of George, but the locket was empty. Instead, engraved on the inside of the silver case were 3 words, etched crudely, almost like an afterthought. Case 85303. My heart nearly stopped. Case 85303. That was the official identification number for the biggest career screw-up of my life. The case that should have made me captain, but instead resulted in me being quietly sidelined for years due to a critical error in evidence handling. It was George's case. He was the prime suspect, and somehow the key piece of evidence disappeared, letting him walk free. I stared at the locket, the letters, and the postmarks. The dates of the affair coincided perfectly with the dates of the investigation. The air in the dusty attic suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The betrayal wasn't just a fling, it was connected to everything. I wasn't just a cuckolded husband, I was a pawn. And now the hunt was on. I crept down from the attic, the small wooden chest tucked beneath my arm like a fever. Diana was downstairs watching a gardening show, her face placid and unremarkable. 40 years. She looked exactly the same as she had when she promised to love and honor me. That face, so familiar, now felt like a stranger's mask, carefully positioned over a lifetime of deception. I managed a strained hello, which sounded rough and foreign even to my own ears. She barely glanced up. That mundane indifference usually brought me peace. Today it was gasoline on the fire. I avoided her for the rest of the day, locking myself in my home office, the small den I had set up with my old police memorabilia. The letters were spread out on the desk, interspersed with the only 2 known photos of George and Diana from that era. One from our wedding, where George stood grinning as my best man, and another from a New Year's party, where their eyes met with a complicity I was too young and too naive to notice. I saw it now. The secret language of the guilty. But then the worst thought, the most corrosive doubt, wormed its way in. Our son, Michael. He was 40 now, a successful architect, married with kids. The whole American dream I'd worked my hands raw for. Michael was the image of me, everyone always said. Strong jaw, my father's eyes. But when I looked at the New Year's photo of George, really looked at George's smug, handsome face, the resemblance hit me like a rogue wave. The set of the mouth, the slight tilt of the head when he smiled. Suddenly, the strong jaw wasn't mine. It was George's. The shock of recognition was brutal. It was like watching a movie of my own life, only to realize I was playing the role of the fool. I called Michael that night under the guise of discussing a minor repair at his house. The conversation was agonizingly superficial. I kept searching his voice, his mannerisms, his simple laughter, trying to find a trace of myself. I found nothing but the crushing fear that I had spent 4 decades loving, guiding, and financially supporting a ghost, a person who was not my own blood. I didn't hate Michael, I hated the lie he represented. The detective in me, the part I thought I had retired, immediately took over, pushing the emotional wreck aside. This wasn't about yelling at Diana, this was about proof, about strategy, and about finding the truth behind Case 85303. My first target, DNA. Getting a sample from George would be tricky. He was careful, polished, and currently suspicious of nothing. Getting one from Michael was easier, but infinitely more painful. I needed undeniable scientific certainty before I burned my life down. I started planning the logistics with the meticulous detail I once used to plan stakeouts. For Michael, I planned to simply swap out his toothbrush during a casual visit, a classic rookie move, but effective. For George, it would require a social gathering. George was due to come over next week to finalize the details of a community fund we were establishing, a perfect, sterile opportunity. In the meantime, my relationship with Diana became a silent movie. I was physically present, yet entirely absent. We ate dinner in chilling silence. I offered single-word replies. Diana, bless her heart, or perhaps cursed by her own long-held guilt, simply accepted my distant mood as Howard being moody, a side effect of my recent retirement boredom. But I was never bored. I was awake. Every time she reached for my hand, I recoiled internally, substituting her touch for the chilling thought. You knew. You protected him. You let him walk away with my career. The silence was a cage, and I was the only one who knew the bars were closing in. The hunt had to continue, or I would drown in the silence. The letters in the locket were only the first chapter. I needed the whole book. I was no longer just a betrayed husband looking for comfort. I was a cop again, but this time, the crime scene was my life. The engraving on the locket, Case 85303, felt less like a code and more like an open wound that had been festering for 40 years. That number represented the biggest, most humiliating failure of my career, the one that stopped me from making captain and left me feeling like a second-rate detective until the day I retired. I needed the archives. Official channels were out. You don't just walk into the NYPD records department and ask to reopen a decades-old case that was officially marked as operator error by a young detective. Me. Especially when the suspect, George, is now a powerful, high-profile businessman and a major community donor. I called Frank. Frank had been my partner in the 80s, a solid guy who retired early to start a high-end security consultancy. He owed me a few favors dating back to a dicey situation involving a stolen car and a judge's son. Frank asked no questions, which told me everything I needed to know about my reputation. A day later, a heavily redacted digital file, the official summary of Case 85303, landed in a secure folder on my old police laptop. Reading that file was like reading the blueprint of my life's destruction. The case involved high-level financial fraud and municipal corruption, serious stuff that could have taken down a lot of prominent people, with George at the very top. I was the lead detective responsible for securing the star witness's testimony, a critical audio recording that would have sealed George's fate. But just days before the grand jury met, the recording was ruled contaminated and inadmissible due to a procedural flaw. The investigation collapsed, George walked away clean, and I took the fall. I was labeled careless. The dates of the evidence failure jumped off the screen. They matched the dates of George's most intimate letters to Diana, not just generally, but down to the week. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a connection forged in poison. My hands gripping the mouse were shaking, not from weakness, but from pure incandescent rage. George hadn't just seduced my wife for a cheap thrill, he had used her as a tool. He had leveraged the threat of exposing their affair to force Diana to sabotage my evidence, either by planting something or simply creating enough doubt to contaminate the chain of custody. He wasn't just a cheater, he was a manipulator who stole my dignity and my future. I looked at Diana across the room. She was folding laundry, humming a soft tune. She was both the victim of a predator and the architect of my career's ruin. I couldn't see the woman I loved. I only saw the ghost of the compromised young wife. I felt an isolation so profound it was physical. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. The confrontation would yield tears and denials. George's downfall, the justice I deserved, had had to be clinical and undeniable. The silence in the house was now a battlefield, and I was quietly, methodically, preparing my final perfect attack. The DNA samples I planned to collect next week were no longer just about paternity. They were about securing the perfect weapon against the real enemy. The emotional coldness in our house was starting to feel permanent. Diana tried twice to break through the silence. Once, she asked if I was thinking of going back to work, citing my restlessness. Another time, she simply reached out for my hand while we were sitting on the porch, her eyes full of a plea I couldn't decipher. But the moment I thought of George's letters and that ridiculous locket, the emotional wall slammed shut. I just pulled my hand away, gave her a distant nod, and said I needed more coffee. It hurt, but the cruelty was necessary. I needed space to think like a detective, not a husband. The first step was the easiest, yet most heartbreaking. My son Michael stopped by on a Saturday morning to help me fix a leaky faucet. A perfect, innocuous cover. While he was wrestling with the plumbing under the kitchen sink, completely oblivious, I slipped into his bathroom. His electric toothbrush was sitting in the holder. It took less than 10 seconds to swap out the detachable head for an old, unused one I had saved from a prior bulk purchase. The used head, now sealed in a sterile plastic bag labeled Michael, felt impossibly heavy in my pocket. That tiny piece of plastic held the potential to either confirm my greatest fear or restore 40 years of faith. The entire interaction was stomach-churning. When he left, I felt like a thief in my own home. George's sample required more finesse. The next Tuesday, he came over to discuss the community fund, exactly as planned. George, always immaculate, always smelling faintly of expensive cologne, settled into my office. He was trying to be overly jovial, mentioning old police jokes and patting my shoulder a little too often. I played the role of the confused, slightly forgetful old man well. I mumbled about needing water and brought him a glass of ice-cold mineral water. We talked for an hour. George left 2 clear fingerprints on the glass, but I didn't need those. I needed DNA. As he was leaving, I feigned a clumsy stumble, knocking his expensive briefcase, which he always placed on the floor beside his chair, partially open. He immediately bent down to check its contents, muttering apologies. In that split second, I had my chance. He'd left his used napkin from wiping his lips after the water right on the edge of the desk. In a smooth, practiced movement honed by decades of detective work, I scooped up the napkin with the tips of my fingers and pressed it discreetly into a second sterile bag, labeled George. The exchange of the samples at the private lab was done through Frank. No names mentioned, just 2 anonymous, carefully preserved items. The technician quoted me a minimum of 4 days for the preliminary paternity analysis. Those 4 days felt like 4 years. I spent every waking minute cycling between rage at George, pity for Diana, and terror for Michael. I realized that if Michael was George's son, the emotional leverage George had over Diana 40 years ago wasn't just the threat of exposure, it was the threat of destroying her family before it even began. He had her trapped. That realization made George even more dangerous, and my resolve to bring him down hardened like steel. The only thing left to do now was wait for the results that would determine the direction of my life and George's fate. 4 days felt like the entire 40 years of my marriage condensed into a single grinding moment. I barely slept. When the phone finally rang, it was Frank. His voice was neutral, the professional detachment of a man delivering a cold report, which told me everything I needed to know before he spoke the words. Howard, the analysis is conclusive. Based on the genetic markers you provided, the probability of the two male subjects being father and son is zero. Zero. The word hung in the air, confirming the most devastating suspicion. Michael was George's son. I wasn't his father. 40 years of bedtime stories, college tuition, coaching Little League, all for a child who carried George's blood. The betrayal was absolute. Mathematical certainty. I set the receiver down gently, not with a crash of rage, but with the quiet finality of a lock clicking shut. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just felt a profound, cold calm. The emotional devastation had already happened days ago. This was merely the official confirmation. Yet as the anger at Diana flared, it was immediately eclipsed by a sharper, more focused rage directed at George. Destroying my family life, while tragic, was personal. Ruining my career as a police officer, a career dedicated to justice, was a crime against my very being. The truth about Michael was the biggest piece of evidence I could ever hold against George. But using it in the wrong way would only destroy my son's life, which George had already complicated enough. I pulled out the old file of case 85303 again. I needed to know exactly what Diana was coerced into doing. I meticulously cross-referenced the dates of their most passionate letters with the incident reports. The letters stopped abruptly on the same day the critical evidence, the audio tape, was deemed contaminated. It was obvious. George hadn't threatened to leave Diana. He had threatened to expose the affair to me, knowing that the scandal would ruin my career, and worse, destroy my future family when she was already carrying his child. He had her over a barrel, and he squeezed. This wasn't an act of revenge against a foolish husband. It was an act of survival for George, a cunning attempt to erase evidence that would have put him in prison for a very long time. Diana wasn't just a cheating wife. She was a terrified young woman caught in a blackmailer's trap, forced to choose between the integrity of my career and the stability of her child's future. Her choice was wrong, cowardly, but now I saw the predator clearly. My mission changed completely. The DNA results, the letters, the locket, they were not for destroying Diana. They were for destroying George. Justice, not simple emotional payback, was the only thing that could repair the hole in my soul. I decided right then that Michael would never know the truth about his paternity from me. He would always be my son. My new plan required absolute subtlety. I needed to bring George to my home one last time, to talk him into confessing his 40-year-old crime, and I needed to record every single guilty word. My revenge would be the restoration of the law. With the DNA results locked away and my old case file fully annotated, I was ready to transition from investigator to actor. My goal was simple: lure George into a false sense of security and make him confess his decades-old blackmail scheme on tape. To do that, I needed to become weak. I needed to become forgettable. I started practicing immediately. I would wander into a room and forget why I was there. I'd misplace my keys 3 times a day and stare blankly at the news. Diana, noticing my performance, only grew more worried, which heartbreakingly played right into the plan. She started gently suggesting I should see a specialist. I would just smile, a slow, vacant smile, and agree. The key moment came when I called George. My voice on the phone was strained, slow, and slightly slurred, a careful imitation of a man recovering from a minor stroke. "George," I managed, sounding truly frail. "It's Howard. Listen, old friend, I'm having trouble. My memory, it's going. I've been trying to deal with those old investment accounts, those papers from the early days, but they're just jumbled. I can't make sense of them." I could hear the shift in George's tone instantly. The initial concern melted into avarice. He didn't pity me, he smelled opportunity. George had always assumed I had considerable wealth hidden in those complicated, decades-old accounts. He thought this was his moment to swoop in, gain control, and clean up any loose ends from the past that might be tied up in my old papers. "Howard, my brother, don't you worry about a thing," he said, the false warmth dripping like honey. I'll be right over. You trust me, don't you? We'll handle all those old headaches together. Headaches, I repeated weakly, knowing the biggest headache he had was about to return. The preparation was meticulous. I borrowed a sophisticated military-grade audio recorder from Frank, small enough to fit inside a pocket watch and sensitive enough to catch a whisper from across the room. I spent an entire afternoon wiring my office. The recorder was placed inside an old, heavy bronze clock on the mantelpiece, perfectly aimed at my favorite armchair where I would sit, George. I used a small pinhole camera, a prop I'd kept since my detective days, and concealed it within the spine of a massive, rarely opened law book on a shelf behind him. Every angle was covered. I made sure to leave the original letters in the file of case 85303 prominently displayed on my desk, as if I had been trying to review them myself but had lost the mental capacity to understand. The bait was set. The predator was walking right into the trap. George arrived precisely on time, looking like a page from a men's fashion magazine. He brought a fruit basket, a performative gesture I instantly saw through. Diana, clearly relieved that I was finally getting help, led him into my office. I played my role perfectly. Slow movements, a slight tremor in my left hand, and an occasional unfocused gaze toward the window. "Howard, old boy, you look a little peaky," George said, patting my arm, a gesture that made my skin crawl. He settled into the armchair I had designated, directly beneath the law book, concealing the camera and perfectly within range of the clock's microphone. We started with the surface level, the community fund we supposedly managed. I deliberately fumbled the papers, scattering them across the desk. "See, George? I just can't focus. The numbers swim." George ate it up. He started shuffling the papers, occasionally glancing toward the old safe in the corner. He wasn't interested in the community fund. He was interested in what I might have forgotten in that safe. He even tried to subtly push the conversation towards my will and estate planning, fishing for information. "You know, Howard, it's just responsible. With everything going on, you want to make sure Diana and Michael are taken care of. Maybe we should look at those older investment portfolios first, the ones from the mid-'80s. Those are the trickiest." That was the opening I needed. I leaned forward, lowering my voice conspiratorially. "The '80s? That was a bad year for me, George. The police department. You remember the trouble I had?" His face froze just for a split second, a micro expression of pure panic that only a seasoned detective would spot. He quickly masked it with a forced, jovial laugh. "Oh, Howard, don't dwell on that. Water under the bridge. Just a bureaucratic mix-up. Happens to everyone." "A mix-up," I mumbled, tapping the locket, which I had conspicuously placed next to a stack of old police reports. Or, was it sabotage? I watched him like a hawk. He didn't look at the locket. He didn't look at the reports. He stared directly at me, trying to gauge how much I remembered. He thought I was just rambling. He dismissed my question with a wave of his hand. "Nonsense, Howard. You were under a lot of pressure then. Don't you remember those long nights? That's when you started fighting with Diana, too. High stress." He was pushing the blame onto my marriage, trying to dismiss the career ruin as a side effect of marital strife. He was brilliant, almost convincing, but he still hadn't addressed the elephant in the room. Case 85303. I had to be bolder. The case file. I was just looking at it. The evidence went missing the week Diana was busy. That week you were always over. I let the implication hang heavy in the air. George finally lost a tiny bit of composure. He didn't deny the affair, but he tried to pivot, his voice dropping low, sharp with concealed menace. "Howard, look at me. You are confused. Diana loves you. We were young. Yes, we made a stupid mistake. But if you start stirring up old gossip, you'll ruin her life. And Michael's. Do you really want to drag your son through a scandal now, when he's so successful?" That threat, using Michael as a shield, was the final confirmation. He was trying to silence me with the truth I already knew. His desperate attempt to protect his current reputation by threatening my son sealed his fate. I simply nodded, gave him a small, weak smile, and said, "You might be right, George. Maybe I am just forgetting things." The hook was set deep. He thought he had won. Now I just needed him to confess the rest. George returned 3 days later, ostensibly to organize my investment files. He was more relaxed, certain that the old detective had finally become senile. Diana was out, visiting a relative, which I had carefully arranged. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Just the two of us, and the clock recording every syllable. He sat down, immediately pulling out a thick binder. Howard, I've been thinking about those old 80s assets. They're a mess. We should just liquidate them. Transfer everything into a simple trust for Diana, effective immediately. He was trying to bypass me and secure the money before my alleged condition worsened. I looked directly at him, my eyes sharp and entirely clear. The tremor in my hand vanished. I leaned forward, my voice dropping back into the low, steady register of a detective questioning a suspect. The assets can wait, George. Let's talk about the liabilities. George's smile evaporated. He saw the shift instantly. The eyes of the feeble old man were gone, replaced by the calculating stare of Detective Howard. He didn't panic. He tried to intimidate. What are you talking about, Howard? You're making no sense. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the locket. I placed it on the desk between us, turning it so the engraving Case 85303 faced him. Then I added the two sealed bags containing the DNA samples. George and Michael. I'm talking about how you used a terrified woman and an unborn child, my son as I believed, to sabotage a federal corruption case and save your own skin 40 years ago. His color drained completely. He didn't deny the paternity. The look in his eyes was confirmation enough. He lunged for the locket, but I was faster, slamming my hand down on it. Don't touch the evidence, George. You can't prove anything. Gossip and a stupid necklace? He hissed, his voice trembling with fear and fury. You tell Michael about this, and you destroy him, Howard. Is that what you want for your son? That's why I won't tell him, I countered calmly. I won't destroy Michael because I'm not a monster like you. But you are going to tell me exactly how you blackmailed Diana into contaminating the audio evidence in Case 85303. I showed him the file, pointing to the exact date the evidence was compromised. He looked desperate. He realized the trap was sprung. Seeing no way out, he started talking, his words tumbling out in a broken, frantic stream, a full, undeniable confession. He admitted he threatened Diana. He confessed he showed her the evidence against him and explained that if I succeeded in the case, I would likely become captain, and he would use my rising status to expose the affair, destroying my reputation and ensuring I'd be forced out of the force. He told her she had to choose between my career success and the future of her child. I gave her a choice, Howard. Get rid of the tape or I ruin your life and ensure your illegitimate child never gets your name. He practically screamed the words, convinced that by admitting his cruelty, he was somehow justifying it. I'd let him finish. I watched the shame and the malice fighting on his face. When the torrent stopped, I just pointed to the clock on the mantelpiece where the recorder was spinning silently. Thank you, George. I now have everything I need. The silence that followed was deafening. The long game was almost over. George left my house in a cold fury. He didn't threaten me again. He knew I held the detonator to his life. I let him go, knowing he would spend the next few days in agonizing panic, desperate to find a way to discredit me. He would try to call, but I wouldn't answer. My silence was the final turn of the screw. The following morning, I went to see my old mentor, Captain Hayes. Hayes was retired now, but his moral compass was still perfectly calibrated. He was the one who had felt the most shame when my career stumbled 40 years ago. I didn't mince words. I told him about the locket, the DNA, and the confession, but I focused entirely on the crime. Obstruction of justice and witness tampering that allowed George to escape prosecution. Hayes listened to the entire audio recording from the bronze clock. His face, usually ruddy and cheerful, grew pale and tight. When the tape finished, he looked at me, not with pity, but with profound respect. Howard, he said, his voice husky, you weren't careless. You were betrayed. This isn't just about George, it's about the integrity of the badge. Hayes knew the political landscape better than anyone. George was too prominent to be arrested quietly. A simple complaint would get buried in appeals and legal maneuvering. To ensure the arrest was fast, public, and undeniable, we needed to hit him where he least expected it. The opportunity came 3 days later. The annual City Pioneers Luncheon, an event George virtually chaired. It was a formal, high-profile event where every major donor, politician, and media outlet was present. George would be at his most confident, surrounded by his power base. Hayes and I coordinated with the current district attorney and a few trusted officers who were clean and understood the gravity of reopening a major corruption case. We presented the new evidence, the audio tape being the undeniable core. The DA signed off immediately. I didn't attend the luncheon. I sat at home with Diana making her favorite sandwich, watching the local news coverage of the event. Diana was still confused by my strange clinical behavior, but her eyes held a glimmer of trust that had been absent for weeks. Then the broadcast cut live to the main ballroom. George was on stage basking in the applause after giving a lengthy, self-congratulatory speech about integrity and community values. He looked untouchable. Suddenly, two plainclothes officers and a uniformed lieutenant calmly walked up the stage stairs. George saw them and tried to smile, thinking it was a security detail. The lieutenant stepped forward, and in a voice clear enough for the microphone to catch, he read the charges. Not for the old affair, but for obstruction, coercion, and tampering with evidence. Crimes directly tied to Case 85-303, crimes that never truly expired. George's face shattered. The camera zoomed in as he was led off the stage, past the shocked faces of the city's elite. His reputation, his power base, his freedom, all of it vanished in the space of 3 minutes. He didn't even look in the direction of the camera. I watched the screen, not with triumph, but with quiet satisfaction. I had not sought money or physical revenge. I had sought justice, the only currency that truly mattered to the detective in me. George was gone. Now it was time to put my own house back in order. The news report ended, and the house fell silent. Diana looked at the television, then at me. Her eyes were wide, but not with confusion anymore. They were clear, searching, and terrified. She knew that George's downfall was connected to my recent, strange behavior. This was the hardest part, putting the emotional pieces back together. I turned off the set and took her hands. "Diana," I started, my voice soft, without any hint of the old bitterness. "You were never a willing participant in the crime. You were a victim of blackmail. You were forced to choose between protecting your reputation and saving my life from public scrutiny, or protecting George from prison." I played her the final part of the recording, not George's confession about the evidence, but his frantic threat. "I ruin your life and ensure your illegitimate child never gets your name." When she heard her blackmailer's desperate voice, she finally broke down. She wasn't crying for the shame of the affair, but for the relief of the secret being lifted after 40 years. I didn't need forgiveness. I needed honesty. We talked for hours, revisiting that miserable time. She confirmed everything. George had used her fear and her love for me, her new husband, to force her hand. She thought she was protecting me from a life-altering scandal. We rebuilt our marriage that afternoon, piece by honest piece, on a foundation of truth, not silence. The hardest conversation was with Michael. He came over the next day, bewildered by George's arrest. I told him the truth, but I framed it carefully. I confirmed that George was his biological father, but immediately made it clear. DNA doesn't make a man a father, Michael. Being there for the first steps, the graduation, the late-night talks, that makes a man a father. And that man is me. I chose you, and I choose you now. George only ever saw you as leverage. Michael, now a grown man, didn't need a biological father. He needed closure. He hugged me tighter than he ever had before. He understood the pain I had endured and the justice I had served. He knew that I had protected him from a painful truth for decades, and that I had only acted now to right a 40-year-old criminal wrong. He respects me more than ever. Life changed. Diana and I are closer than we've been since we were newlyweds. We sold the house not out of necessity, but out of choice. We bought a smaller place on the coast, fulfilling a dream we put on hold when I was stuck in my police career. I finally feel the quiet peace I deserved. I found justice, and in doing so, I rediscovered my peace and my true family. George sits in a cell, his empire dismantled, while I watch the sunset with the woman I truly love, now free from her guilt. But I have to ask you, the viewers, something important. I spent 40 years living with a painful half-truth, all to protect my son and my wife from a predator. I waited, gathered my evidence, and ensured George paid for his crime, not just the affair. Tell me, did I do the right thing? Would you have revealed the painful truth to your son sooner? Or would you have chosen the long, cold, calculated path of justice, even if it meant risking your own sanity? What would you have done in my place? If this story resonated with you, and if you respect the long game of true justice, please smash that like button and drop your honest opinion in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss another true story of revenge, mystery, and ultimate redemption.